Title: The Legacy I Never Expected. I never thought I'd find myself standing in the middle of my stepfather's living room, clutching my coat and fighting the urge to scream. "You need to leave, Jake," Michael said again, his voice as cold as the stone beneath our feet. "This house is mine now. You're not welcome here." The words stung like salt on a wound, but they were nothing compared to the bitterness that filled my chest as I looked at my stepbrother. His face was tight, his eyes filled with an anger that I couldn't quite understand. After all, it wasn't like Richard, my stepfather, had ever been a warm figure in my life. But now, standing in his empty house, I couldn't help but wonder if I was about to lose everything. I had always known that Richard didn't love me. I was just a kid when my mom, Sarah, married him. I remember the first time I met Richard at 9 years old. My mom had introduced us with a hopeful smile, but Richard hadn't shared in her enthusiasm. He was rough around the edges, tough, and unapproachable. He barely acknowledged me, and when he did, it was usually with a critique of my manners or my grades. "You should do better, Jake," he'd say. "Boys your age shouldn't be this stupid." I wanted to prove him wrong, but no matter how hard I tried, it felt like nothing was ever good enough for Richard. And when Michael came along, things got worse. Michael, who had his whole future laid out for him in Richard's eyes, was the golden child. Richard would praise him for every little thing: his grades, his athletic achievements, his charming smile. Meanwhile, I was stuck on the sidelines, always second best. When Michael married Emma, his high school sweetheart, and moved out, I thought maybe things would get better. I would have more time with Richard to understand him, to bridge the gap between us. But it never worked out that way. When my mom passed away, I was left alone with Richard, and even then, despite everything, I still tried to care for him. He was old, sick, and bitter, but I did what I could. I cooked for him, took him to appointments, and kept the house in order. But no matter what, he never softened toward me. Then one day, Richard was gone. His sudden death at 65 left a hole in the family. Despite all the years of resentment and anger, I found myself standing over his coffin, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. It was at the funeral that Michael showed up with his family, looking more like he owned the place than a grieving son. When we got back to the house afterward, he insisted that I leave. "This is my inheritance, Jake. I don't know why you're still here. You're not family anymore." His words hit like a slap in the face. I had never expected to be treated as family, but his claim was one I wasn't ready to accept. I wanted to fight back, to say something, but something in me broke that day. The years of feeling like an outsider, of never being good enough for Richard, came flooding back. I quietly grabbed my things, walked out the door, and never looked back. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Days later, I received an unexpected call from Richard's lawyer, Mr. Thompson. He asked me to meet him at the house to discuss something urgent. I didn't know what to expect, but I assumed it had something to do with the estate. When I arrived, I was surprised to find Michael and Emma there, looking just as confused as I felt. Mr. Thompson stood by the fireplace, a solemn look on his face. "Jake, Michael," he began, "I have some important news to share." He pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to me. I stared at it for a moment before opening it, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was Richard's will. I thought it would be a quick read, filled with legal jargon and a final division of property. But what I found shook me to my core. Richard had left everything to me. The house, his savings, his assets, all of it. Michael stood there, stunned, his face slowly turning red with fury. "This can't be right," he muttered. "I'm his son. I should be the one to inherit everything." Mr. Thompson nodded gravely. "Richard's decision was final. He left this letter for you, Jake. He wanted you to understand his reasoning." I felt my stomach drop as I read the letter aloud. Richard's handwriting was clear, but the words felt like a punch to the gut. "Jake, I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I was tough on you, too harsh at times. I never showed you the love you needed, and for that, I'm sorry. But I've seen the man you've become, and I realize now that I was wrong. You were always the one who took responsibility. You didn't run away from your problems. You cared for me when I didn't deserve it, and I can't change that. Michael may be my biological son, but you, Jake, are the one who has shown me what real strength is. I'm leaving everything to you, Not because of some mistake, but because you've earned it. I hope you can forgive me for all the ways I failed you. I couldn't breathe. I looked up at Michael, whose face had gone pale with disbelief. Emma's eyes were wide with shock, and I saw something in Michael's expression that I hadn't expected: guilt. Is this some kind of joke? Michael demanded, his voice trembling. He couldn't have meant this. He hated you. I know, I whispered. But he didn't, Michael. Not really. I turned to Mr. Thompson. Are you sure this is real? It's genuine, Mr. Thompson replied. This is what Richard wanted. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Michael stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, leaving me standing there in the wake of my stepfather's final decision. I didn't know what to do with the inheritance at first. Richard's harshness had scarred me for years, but now I had to reconcile the father I'd wanted with the one I'd gotten. I thought about what Richard had written in the letter, about how he had finally realized my value. I had spent so many years wishing for his approval, but I was beginning to understand that maybe I never needed it to be whole. I used some of the money to start a scholarship in Richard's name, a way to give back and to try and make sense of all the wasted years. It felt right to do something good, to help others who were in the same position I had once been. As I sat in the house that now belonged to me, I realized something. Richard had never been a perfect father, but he had been human. His love was flawed, but it was there. And for all the pain and frustration I had felt, I finally understood his message. It wasn't about the money or the property. It was about the lessons I'd learned through the years, about forgiveness, responsibility, and the complicated nature of family. And maybe, just maybe, Richard had finally figured that out too. As I walked through the rooms of the house, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was mine to shape.